Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, January 22nd, and I'm your host, Cara Santa Maria. And not only am I time traveling right now, I'm also teleporting. I guess that's the right word, because currently I am in the Netherlands filming for National Geographic. But this week's episode, you guys, is so good. I got to record it last week in person, which is great. I'm always happy when I get to record episodes in person, because there's just a special kind of magic that I know I don't believe in magic. A je ne sais quoi, maybe that's a better way to put it, that happens when you get to look into somebody's eyes. But before we talk about that, I want to thank those of you who made Talk Nerdy possible this week. Now remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download. That's because of the support from listeners like yourself. Many of you support the show. You've gone to patreon.com and you've pledged any amount, 50 cents, $1 per episode, $5 per episode, $10 per episode. Some of you awesome people even pledge $50, $100, $25. I'm going to go ahead and give you a shout out right now. That includes Phil T-Bear, Pedro M. Rosario Barbosa, Jeffrey Perez, Charles Payet, Jonathan Wright, Christian Jeffrey, The Honorable Husband, Jafe, Gabriel Felipe Jaramillo Gonzalez, Brian Holden, and last but definitely not least, Jeffrey Sewell. Big shout out to Jeffrey Sewell. Your support has been incredible. And in many ways, you've single-handedly helped this podcast keep trucking along. Guys, if you want to hear your name at the top of the show, you just got to go to patreon.com and pledge your support in any amount over $25. And there's a new store in the works. So soon we're going to have lots of cool new Talk Nerdy swag. If you have recommendations or interests in the kind of swag that you think I should sell in the store, drop me a line at shoptalknerdy@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. Okay, guys. This week's episode features James Askew. He's a PhD candidate in evolutionary biology at the University of Southern California's Jane Goodall Research Center. He is a conservation biologist, and he has so many fascinating stories to tell. He was recently involved in the recognition of a newly described species of orangutan, and we're going to talk all about exactly how that would work. So freaking cool. But also there's a sad side of this story because, of course, even though science has just now discovered that this species exists and is a distinct species, it's already critically endangered. So guys, this podcast is informative, it's motivating, and I don't know, I was really entertained. We'll see if you are. So without any further ado, here he is, James Askew. James, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Thank you.
On this
Cara.
like really rainy LA day.
Yeah, it's not the best out there. Sort of the traffic is terrible, and yeah, I don't think I've seen LA this wet in a while.
It's I know. Good, though. I left today. I was super sick earlier this week, so I haven't really left the house much, but I did go today to brunch, and I was like, oh, I forgot that people in LA can't drive in the rain. It's such a nightmare. 8 people, no, maybe it was even 12, I was reading, have died in the mudslides so far. Yeah. Just horrible. Like first they get hit with the fires and then in the exact same places, of course, because of the fires, or I guess in combination with that, the mudslides are just terrible. I think I'm pretty lucky where I am that there hasn't been too much damage, but apparently just this morning, a truck overturned on the 5 and blocked the 5. Yeah,
that's
terrible.
Crazy.
I know. We're not used to weather out here. We're very privileged living in LA. You obviously aren't from LA.
No, I'm from Bristol, England, but I've been living here for just over 6 years now. But I spent 3 of those living in Indonesia for my research.
So you came to LA for your PhD?
Yeah. I moved here to work with a professor at the University of Southern California, Roberto Delgado. We sort of were talking about my research before while I was doing my master's in Borneo. And sort of one thing led to another, and here I am kind of thing.
Cool. So you started out in England, where you're from, but you ended up in Borneo for your master's.
Yeah.
So you've been able to continue a similar research project throughout your academic career.
Yeah, it actually worked out really well. My master's thesis sort of led into my PhD research. I've basically just continued my topic, and it's also the same as my advisors. So yeah, I've just been very fortunate on that front.
I assume that wasn't a happy accident, but you sought out your advisor because of the work he does?
Yeah, exactly that. So when I was writing up my thesis, he obviously had written a PhD thesis that was very, very similar to mine. And so this kind of is often how it works with PhD programs. You know, you get in contact with people beforehand and you talk about your similar research interests and kind of develop that relationship. And then, yeah, when it came to applying to grad school, I sort of asked him if he was looking for any graduate students, and he was, and I applied, and yeah, the rest.
That's nice. It's nice when it works out that way, because sometimes they're not seeking students, or they wait a couple years and the timing doesn't work out.
You got to have that luck in terms of the fit and in terms of the timing and in terms of the program, and sort of everything just came together for me here.
And also, an American PhD, from what I've gathered, correct me if I'm wrong, differs a little bit from some European PhDs in that you have a shitload of coursework you have to do here. So not only were you wanting to go back to Borneo to do your field work, which we'll talk about in a bit, you also had to balance that with taking classes.
Yeah. So obviously that is a big difference. A British PhD would take 3 years with no classes virtually. You're sort of in and done. I was quite lucky in that because I already had a master's. USC allowed me to convert credits across that I'd already taken. So
that's nice.
I got sort of through my qualifying exam very, very quickly and was kind of able to skip quite a lot. And I also really loved taking classes. I mean, the kind of American liberal arts education, you sort of have this broad breadth of things that you can take. And, you know, I learned a huge amount in my first 2 years here, kind of just from taking classes and having the chance to engage with the faculty in schools that I would never have sort of encountered if I'd stayed in Europe. So I'm definitely a big proponent of the American PhD system, having gone through it.
That's good to hear. It's re-energizing me. I am in my second semester back, and oh my God, the coursework. And of course, none of my master's units translated or transferred because my master's was in neuroscience and my PhD is in clinical psychology. And so even though there's so much overlap in the content, the actual classes aren't the same. And so I have to just redo a bunch of shit.
And how are you finding sort of coming back into sort of classwork again? Is it a big jump?
It would be if I was doing it traditionally, like if I was in an actual brick and mortar class with a bunch of people in their 20s. I think that would have been hard for me. But because I'm doing most of the coursework is remote and you're only in class a couple weeks out of the year doing one-on-one at these big sessions, my program is specifically for like adult learners, so distance learners. A lot of these people already work as clinicians and they just want to get their license. But I think that would be hard. The hardest thing for me that I've learned is having gone away from actual traditional academia and been in public science communication for so long, I'm having to unlearn all of the things I learned about writing for the public and relearn jargon and dense awfulness.
All of those shortcuts have to go. And it's sort of, I find sort of one of my biggest issues with academia. Academic writing is so dry. It's so unengaging and just, they're kind of, has to be a better way of getting the message across, but it's very, very hard when you have to write for you're writing for reviewers and you're having to sort of put references in every sentence kind of thing, and it just doesn't flow so well.
And there's so much of it, and I'm realizing I mean I've already known this about myself, but it's just reinforcing that I hate writing. I hate it. It's just not my favorite thing to do. So, you have to write to be an academic. You're writing all the time. Where are you in the final process? Because you're a PhD candidate, right? You've gone to candidacy for people who know what that means, which means you're done with all your classes.
Yep.
And how much of your dissertation have you written?
So the plan is that this should be my final semester. It's right at the start of the final semester, but I've written sort of a good chunk, maybe about a third, a little more than a third I have sort of on paper, and then everything else is kind of
that's great
in rough bits and bobs. So I have sort of 4 months to get everything tied together and nicely packaged for my committee. And
plenty of time. Most people write their dissertation in like 4 weeks, right?
This is what everyone tells me. I mean, it's now getting to the point that I'm starting to panic a little bit, but no, I think I have a good sort of set of advisors at USC who kind of look after me well and will sort of provide me comments when I need them on the chapters as I send them through. And it's but definitely it is that time to just get the thing written.
It's so exciting. So, okay, I'm really excited to dive in and talk about the actual work that you're doing. You maybe, I don't know if I should say famously, because we haven't quite talked about it yet, but somewhat famously worked on a really exciting discovery that was published both academically and in kind of public press, which is really, really a big deal because that doesn't always happen when it crosses over. And so is this discovery, which again, we're about to talk about, your part of your PhD thesis, or is it a lot more than that?
Sure. I mean, it will be part of my PhD thesis, but certainly only the part that I focused on. So only the
Gotcha,
part
because
that
you
I
were
did.
one piece.
Yeah, I was one sort of piece of evidence that was working towards it. I mean, I guess we should say
We should. I know. I'm like, really, I'm trying to make this into a mystery novel or something. Okay, so tell me about this orangutan species that was never before known to science.
Yeah, so I worked on this paper that came out in Current Biology about the new species of orangutan, or the newly described species of orangutan.
I know, isn't it so like white people? I don't know, like such a gross thing to say, like a new species, when it's obviously existed for as long as it's existed.
We've sort of, and we've known that this population was living there for sort of, I think it was discovered in the 1930s, but really has only been studied up there since the early 2000s. And so, yeah, we as a team of scientists from around the world, we've sort of worked to put different pieces of evidence together and kind of felt like we had enough to make this species designation. And it's sort of really interesting how sort of it's all worked together. It's a really nice example of kind of science and all of these different methodologies fitting together in a really nice piece of work. So obviously I'm really delighted and really proud to have been part of that.
So cool. It's kind of a microcosm of really the argument for evolution. Not that we need to be still arguing for evolution, but when people say that they don't believe in it or they don't think it exists, and you try to explain how many converging lines of evidence there really are, this species description utilizes those multiple lines of evidence, doesn't it? So let's talk about that. Where are these orangutans?
So I work across Sumatra and Borneo. This new species is on the island of Sumatra. It's just south of the crater lake Toba, which is a volcano that erupted 75,000 years ago or so, and it's the world's largest crater lake. It's sort of a beautiful place to go for rest and relaxation. Like we used to obviously really enjoy that when we had time away from the field.
Nice.
But yeah, so this population, there's basically 14,000 orangutans in Sumatra, give or take.
Okay.
Of which 13,200 live to the north of the volcanic crater in the Losa ecosystem, and 800 of them live to the south in this area we call the Tapanuli forest, or the Batang Toro forest block. And it's this sort of beautiful forested area. It's about 150,000 hectares, high up in the mountains, very, very remote. It was very difficult to get up there.
Oh, so it's like on a slope?
Yeah. It's sort of incredibly rugged, It's montane, submontane hill forest.
Okay.
So where I was, we were working at an altitude of about 1,000 meters above sea level. 6 to 8 hours hiking to get in there.
And this isn't like a hiking trail like I'm used to in LA. This is like hiking with machetes.
It's just straight up.
Yeah.
I mean, there were trails because
there are.
Obviously the research camp has been open sort of since 2006-ish.
Okay.
So the trail's sort of relatively well worn by now, but it's just straight uphill the whole way.
I don't know if I'd be fit enough to do it. So now, not only do you have to be, intellectually where you need to be to do this kind of work, you also have to be like physically fit to do this kind of work. Who knew?
Yeah, I mean, getting in and out is difficult. I mean, following the animals around is not so tiring. It depends where you are. For me, montane was okay forest. Swamps are the worst.
Really?
You spend your whole day waist deep in water and just, it's miserable.
And do you do that when you're studying other animals, or do orangutans hang out in swamps too?
In swamps too. So
I didn't know that.
Actually, the highest densities are found in swamps. That's sort of their ideal habitat. That's where they have kind of the highest productivity forest.
Can I tell you, I think everything I know about orangutans I know from Planet of the Apes. Isn't that terrible? I feel like it's one of those, it's the most bizarre of the great ape species. Mm-hmm. And we think of them as these like lovely, gentle giants. We always think of them as sort of the tame, nice apes. I'm not sure how true to life that is, but they're not as I don't know what the right word I'm looking for. I guess because they don't look like us the way that chimps and bonobos do. I don't feel like I am as exposed to them in popular culture as I am some of these. Or I guess because of Diane Fossey with gorillas and because of Jane Goodall with chimpanzees, there isn't really an orangutan version of that in popular culture, is there?
I mean, so there was the third of Leakey's angels, as they were called. He also had a researcher who went out to Indonesia, Brute Galdikas, and she's now at Simon Fraser University, I believe, but they also have an office here in Los Angeles. And she went out and she did a bunch of work in sort of Borneo, and a lot of what we know about orangutans, similarly to Goodall and similarly to Fossey, we know because of her early research and things. And so that was, she never quite got the same profile as the other two did. There's various reasons for that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably hard to put our finger on exactly why, but it is interesting that orangutans as a species are, I think, still a bit elusive in my mind. And I wonder how representative that is of like popular culture.
Yeah, I could see that. I mean, they're a lot more difficult to study. They're a lot sort of, we'll spend days where you're just following one animal around. They're not social in the same way as chimps and bonobos and gorillas are. But I mean, they actually, we do think have this kind of much more complicated social life than we give them credit for. But yeah, they're much more difficult to study. They're not as, I mean, people don't think of them being as human, but I would sort of argue that they are.
Interesting.
They do sort of have complex culture and tool use and things and these really interesting relationships that we sort of get to see on the daily basis in the forest.
And is that a requirement for that sort of classification to be a great ape? Do you have to have demonstrated tool use?
No, it's just purely a genetic thing.
Gotcha.
An evolutionary relationship thing rather than
a behavioral thing. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know, it's fascinating. I wonder too if because the other three that I was just mentioning are African apes and these are Asian apes that we just don't, I don't know, something about like the great beasts of Africa is like very exciting and imaginative to us. And Indonesia is so far away, it's just maybe like kind of here in the West, a forgotten place.
Yeah, a little bit. I think so. And I think, for me, it's a massive shame. I mean, Indonesia is sort of the fourth largest country on the planet. I've obviously lived there the fourth largest by population, fourth largest population.
Really?
But you sort of don't think of it. It's sort of, I think it's 200 and something million people live there.
No way.
Yeah.
I guess there's a lot of islands.
It's a lot of islands.
But doesn't like everybody live in like one?
About half the population lives on Java.
On Java,
and then everyone else lives spread across these sort of hundreds, if not thousands, of islands. But it's a stunning place to visit. You sort of have, especially when we're thinking in terms of science and evolutionary things, you have obviously the only Asian grey ape, or two species of Asian grey ape now.
Yeah.
But you also have the Wallace line.
What's the Wallace line?
So this is this line between the Sunda Plate. I can't remember what the plate on the eastern side is, but sort of if you go down the east coast of Borneo and after Bali, all the animals to the east of it are completely different to the animals on the west. And you can see this very clear island biogeography divide.
Neat.
You can kind of see evolution in action. So on one side, you have sort of these Sulawesi macaques, the kind of crested macaques that take, a few years ago, one of them took a selfie and, there was this whole court battle over who owned the photograph and things
because he took somebody's camera.
Yeah. And so, we sort of see, and it's named for Alfred Russel Wallace.
That's cool. That's really cool.
Yeah.
And that must be so exciting as an evolutionary biologist, as a conservationist, to see sort of island evolution in action, right? Because islands are the place where evolution is sort of the most extreme and bizarre and amazing. It really is evolution on steroids.
Yeah, and I've been sort of very fortunate in that I've gotten to work on a new or describing a new species of orangutan, but also in the forest that I was working in, you can see a massive difference between where I worked in Borneo and where I worked in Sumatra. I was sort of in the north of Sumatra getting chased around by elephants, and we'd get camera trap photos of tigers, and it's sort of this spectacular jungle with it's kind of like the Jungle Book. We sort of describe it as just life everywhere, and then you go across to Borneo and the productivity changes and the species change, and it's sort of this very, very different habitat that you're going through. And just, yeah, I've been very fortunate to get to work in some of the most spectacular jungles in the world. And obviously I hope that continues for a long time.
Sounds incredible. So we were discussing these two orangutan, at the time, what we thought were orangutan populations, one living in the north, one living in the south, the one in the south very, very high up on the mountain.
Yeah.
And people always knew, not always, but for a long time knew that this group was there, but didn't really think much of it, right?
Yeah.
It's just a small population that lives separate from this other population. So what did you guys discover, or why did you even think to start digging deep into the behavior and the genetics?
Yeah, so I mean, it started with the genetics. So the guys from the University of Zurich and the Bogor Agricultural University in Indonesia were sort of working together to do the genetics of all the different populations of orangutans around Sumatra, so you can see how related they are and see sort of how the evolutionary migrations have gone and which populations are more related to others. And so they did this research, and it's very, very glamorous. You sort of run around the forest and pick up fecal samples and put them in ethanol and then, transport them back and then have to get permits to get them out. And yeah, it's an absolute nightmare.
Wait, and how do you find actual cells with DNA in the poo? Are they just they're like colon cells that shed off?
I presume it must be. I mean, it's not
because there's so many other species living in poo.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, right, exactly.
But I guess there's not that many other eukaryotic species that live in your poo, I would assume. That would be bad. They probably have a lot of parasites and shit.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
Anyway.
And actually that's sort of a major conservation issue with humans getting closer and closer is that the parasite loads seem to be going up and up.
Yikes.
But anyway, so they took these samples back and found sort of some really interesting genetic results. And basically, so this population further south on Sumatra is genetically closer to the animals in Borneo than it is to the animals 200 kilometers to the north.
Okay, let me get this straight. So island of Sumatra, which I'm not sure if I misspoke before. I may have said Borneo, so I want to be clear. Island of Sumatra, two different populations, one north of the volcano, one south.
Yep.
They only live 200
kilometers.
That was very British. Okay, I'm trying to imagine how far that is. 200 kilometers apart. That's less than 200 miles.
So it's sort of 120 miles.
There you go.
Like
not far. Yeah. Not far at all. 2 hours by car, but not really because they're in the mountains. And then this population that's south of the volcano is more similar genetically to a population on a completely different island?
A completely different island. Yeah.
How? What?
So basically what it seems is that these guys are the ancestral population. So you had...
To both?
To both.
So it's not that... Wait, I'm so confused.
So the Sunda Plate used to be not... There didn't used to be an ocean between Sumatra and Borneo.
Cool. So they drifted apart how long ago?
So it's not so much they drifted apart. You had the sea level rise in between them, split them from
the
animals in Borneo.
Okay. So this was like there were these volcanic kind of lands, so they had different topography. The sea used to be lower.
Yeah, so you used to be able to get from sort of the Malay Peninsula down all the way into Borneo, Sumatra, Java, like the whole of Indonesia, or everything west of the Wallace Line was above the ocean.
Like the Bering Strait, long time ago. You could just walk right across.
You could just walk right across.
Okay, but then the sea level rose. There's an ocean between them, and I doubt orangutans have figured out how to make boats. So they're not big swimmers.
No.
They're swampy swimmers.
They're swampy swimmers. They can swim a little. I'm not sure they swim, but they wade.
Gotcha. But not across an ocean.
But not across an
okay.
ocean. No.
So that
split
means,
them off from Borneo.
So that means they were split early on, before the ocean ever rose.
Yeah, they were split, but there will have been some gene flow between them while the ocean was still down.
So we think now that this population south of the volcano in Sumatra was actually ancestrally the oldest population.
Yeah.
Okay. And they ventured off to Borneo, which at the time they could walk to, first.
Yeah. I mean, it would be all at the same time. They would have spread in and then gone.
So then why would the one north of the volcano be genetically more different? How does that work?
Well, so you have a couple of reasons. Firstly, the area between them is obviously very, very mountainous. And so it's quite difficult to get through between them anyway. It seems like there was a very limited gene flow sort of for hundreds of thousands of years.
So the mountains actually divided them more intensely than the ocean.
Yeah.
Because the ocean was much newer.
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to ask a geneticist on that front. But certainly there's only a bit of gene flow going in one direction. It's only coming from south to north. They're not coming back the other way. And then obviously we have this volcanic eruption 75,000 years ago, and that cuts
obviously
everything.
That's pretty terrible.
Everything.
Yeah.
I mean, so the Toba eruption sort of seems to have changed the climate on the planet and things like that. It's the biggest crater lake in the world. It's massive.
Wow.
Sort of this huge geologic event that kind of changed everything.
That's fascinating.
The area.
And are there a lot of other, just totally random aside, are there a lot of other species? Like, how biodiverse is this area?
For Sumatra, it's not that biodiverse. For in general, it's incredibly biodiverse, right?
Okay.
So every time, and they're sort of really interesting species because you're on top of a mountain. So every time someone goes over there, it's discover a new species. So
wow,
the team that I work with in Sumatra, the Sumatran Orangutan Conservation Program, ran a bunch of amphibian surveys, and they discovered a new species of frog, and they also found a legless lizard. So it's not a snake; it's a lizard without legs.
Weird.
Wait, is it legless? Legless lizard.
I'm going to Google that because that sounds awesome.
And it's
in Sumatra?
Yeah. And it's
amazing.
Sort of, it hadn't been seen anywhere since the early 1900s kind of thing.
Oh, yeah, there it is.
They just found it on top of the mountain kind of thing.
September 15th, 2017, and scorpionmonitor.org, a unique, very rare, and endemic legless lizard, Wegener's glass lizard, was encountered in, am I pronouncing it right, Batang Toru?
Yeah, Batang Toru.
Wow. Yeah. Oh, it's so freaky looking.
So yeah, they find, and it's just anything, right? They go out and do orchid surveys. They sort of got potentially 4 or 5 new species of orchid. It's like this stunningly beautiful rainforest, and sort of the only area of montane habitat that's being studied in the area. And then you've got sort of some interesting Sumatran species as well. So you have tigers, Sumatran tigers.
So you do have these like mega fauna,
tapirs up there, Malay tapirs. Those are really cool. I mean, obviously I never...
Do they still have the prehensile penis?
I think they do, yeah.
It's like all I know about the tapir.
It's all anybody ever knows about tapirs.
They're so crazy. Oh, wow, that's so fascinating. And so you're there, you're around these incredible species. You are not a geneticist. That is not the side of your work, but that's the first kind of piece of this puzzle. Before we get into the incredible work that you do, because to me personally, the behavioral stuff is like a little more interesting, mostly because I think it's more readily translatable than genetics, right? You need a little bit more background, I think, to get the gist of it.
Genetics is hard. Like,
it's hard.
I'm not a geneticist, and so even for me to kind of talk through...
It's complicated.
It's really complicated.
And of course, when you're publishing with a lot of other people, that's why it's good when everybody has their niche. But you mentioned before, only 800 of these creatures. And how many north of the volcano?
13,000, give or take.
13,000.
Yeah.
Orders of magnitude.
But I mean, they're also, so all orangutans are critically endangered.
So just as a genus, orangutans are critically endangered, all of them.
All of them.
And by all of them, this is the only place they live, right? Where else do orangutans live?
So it's just Sumatra and Borneo.
Just these 2 islands.
Just these 2 islands.
And so there are 3 populations, 2 of them genetically quite similar, one of them different enough to be its own species, all 3 of them critically endangered. Mm-hmm. This newly named species, 800 animals?
800 animals left.
It's horrible.
And that's sort of the estimate, right?
You can't count them all.
You can't count them all. So you do nest surveys and you sort of estimate. You come up with estimates based on how far away they are from transects and things like that.
And do you actually track any of them? Do you collar them?
We don't collar them, no. We follow them. So
you just follow them.
So that was basically my job for 3 years, right? Was to go out. You go out first thing in the morning. You run around the jungle. We sort of would, depending on where we were, we'd use cell phones or radios, depending on what the day called for. And you sort of just creep along really slowly, sit down a lot, just kind of chill. And you're listening for the sound of an orangutan moving through the trees or eating fruit or something like that. And once you find them, you try not to let them go, and then you just follow them constantly.
You need to know where they are, but are you trying to make sure they don't know that you're there?
No, I mean, there's no way you'd be able to do that. They can tell.
They're way more perceptive.
They know you're there before you know they're there.
Gotcha.
And you have to move very slowly because the orangutan response to you being there is they'll just freeze. and they'll just sit. And
then you're like, just makes your day a lot longer.
So you just have to kind of sit and wait and be really quiet, and eventually they'll move or they'll make a kiss squeak, which is kind of this orangutan sort of fear noise or kind of fear aggression when they're annoyed at you, and then you can tell that they're there, and then you try and follow them and record their behavior every 2 minutes.
And you're doing that from below? Because they're in the trees,
They're
right?
in the trees,
And do they ever come down?
Very rarely in Sumatra.
Okay.
So in Borneo, they spend a lot more time on the ground. And this actually makes them a lot more difficult to follow because they're really fast on the ground, and it's sort of they'll scamper through bushes and things like that, and you lose them. When they're up in the trees, it's a bit more difficult to lose them. It still happens, but you can typically follow them.
Do they poop on you?
Yeah,
they do. That's like the first thing I think of. Is like,
but I mean, part of our job,
fluid?
Right? Part of our job is to collect that, right? We want them to do that, so we can get our genetic samples and get our sort of parasite samples. It's very glamorous, obviously.
Very glamorous. And when they're up there in the trees, are they alone? Do mothers have babies with them? Are there any family units?
So the family unit is typically mother infants.
Okay.
You don't see anything beyond that. Normally, male offspring are a little bit, they'll stay with the mother a bit longer and kind of follow them around and stuff.
Hilarious.
It's interesting.
How long do they, would a baby girl stay with mom?
Depends which island. So it's different. It's different from Sumatra to Borneo. Sumatra, I believe it's something like kind of 8 years roughly.
Jeez. Really?
Borneo, it's a bit quicker.
That's a long time. I didn't expect it to be so long. I mean, still compared to humans, it's not. But I always think of us as being sort of the least capable on our own.
Yeah.
And I guess I assume great apes are similar in some respects, but I never expected it to be quite as long.
Yeah, and it's one of the reasons that sort of orangutans are so critically endangered is because they have such a long interbirth interval, and they have such a long time period of needing to live with their parents. And it's sort of interesting because you can kind of think about why live with their mother, not with their parents.
Yeah.
The males just kind of go. It's sort of interesting to kind of think about why that might be, right? Because you sort of have these animals that are quite solitary. They very rarely come across one another. And so to kind of learn the skills to be an orangutan, it takes a very long time, but also to learn the sort of social relationships that you need to be part of an orangutan population is also going to take a long time. You're sort of not going to get, like you do with chimpanzees, you sort of have a lot of different teachers, a lot of different individuals to learn from and to play with and to...
Yeah, because you can be around dozens of chimps at the same time. So you learn your social hierarchy within months.
Yeah.
But I guess if you're only coming across them every few days,
not
even. Really? How often?
Every few months,
every
maybe.
Few months. Yeah, of course.
If that, they'll sort of be... There's males that we would see in the research site sort of once every 4 years kind of thing.
Yeah, so then how do you ever learn who's alpha?
Ranges. Yeah.
Wow.
It's sort of this very different social structure to how we think about other...
So it's really not about weaning. They're not weaning for 8 years. They're eating solid food by then. They're just learning how to survive.
Yeah.
Wow. What do orangutans eat? Fruit?
Yeah, mostly fruit, but also, I mean, the longer you study orangutans, the more fruits and different things you'll see them eat. They kind of go after, try a bit of everything. Insects, fungi.
So they are omnivores. They eat insects?
Yeah,
okay, but not like small mammals?
So Sumatran orangutans will eat lorises.
Okay.
But Bornean orangutans have never been seen to do so.
Interesting.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that you develop a taste for food, I guess because it was more abundant at some time.
Yeah, I mean, the Sumatran forests are generally more productive, and Sumatran orangutans are generally more social, and they generally show much more interesting cognitive abilities as a result. They kind of have, and we don't know whether that's because they're more social or because they have a greater range of fruits, so they have to learn how to open these different fruits and how to extract food from them, and so this is sort of a driver for cognitive skills, or being in larger social groups could be a driver for cognitive skills. There's kind of these two competing theories about why it is.
It's fascinating. I'm going to throw a curveball at you.
Mm-hmm.
Don't let me offend you if you're like, I have no idea. Why are you asking me that, Cara? But the other day I was on a podcast. Is this where it came from? Yeah, I think it was when I was podcasting, a guest podcast on a comedian show. And somebody backstage was telling me about this hypothesis basically about human cognition, how and why did humans develop this type of cognition when other animals there does seem to be a gap, right? Like language, different things like contemplating death, things like that. And there was this hypothesis about like drugs, like drug use, like psychedelic drug use.
Sounds very Los Angeles.
It did sound really LA. And I was like, that's bullshit. But then I was also thinking about the fact that, of course, I could see an ape finding a plant that like gave it some sort of, sense of broadened consciousness, like it eats some sort of fungus or eats some sort of thing and then like trips balls, right? And it's like, wow, that's pretty crazy. I don't really understand how that would induce this change evolutionarily, but this person seemed to have read many books about it. And I was like, I have legit never even heard of that hypothesis.
That's crazy. I've never heard of it. I mean, the only way that I would it kind of vaguely makes sense, certainly not with primates, although the orangutans do have this really interesting kind of fur rubbing where they'll self-medicate, go and find certain leaves and kind of rub them against themselves and swallow them and things. And we think that's kind of to reduce their parasite load and stuff like that. But one thing with regard to human evolution, there does seem to have been this leap forward when we stopped sleeping in trees and started sleeping on the ground. And potentially that's because we went into a deeper sleep and were able to dream more, and that sort of, in terms of this broadening of your consciousness and in terms of having these greater levels of creativity, it allows you to come up with sort of these crazy kind of cognitive abilities that then sort of drive further crazy cognitive abilities, right? You dream about an interesting type of tool, you start making that interesting type of tool, it becomes kind of more.
Yeah, you problem solve kind of before you actually do it physically.
And so you start selecting for this bigger brain and you start having kind of this leap forward in cognition. So, I mean, that would sort of be the mechanism, but I don't think that...
And that was kind of right around Australopithecus, right after, right? Because she was quite small. She had like quite a small brain case and was sort of still very tree-like.
Yeah.
She wasn't tree-like. Her hands were... You know what I mean.
Spending some time in the trees and on the ground.
There you go. And I say she as if all Australopithecans were Lucy, right? Most famous. Okay, so sorry, random aside. But back to these orangutans who are not social, blowing my mind, who have their kiddos live with them for a super long time. And by them, I mean to she. Mom is a good caretaker. Dad, he didn't do anything.
Just sort of
knocks him up,
rolls around,
pieces out,
does his own thing.
Okay, and so all of them, unfortunately, critically, and I'm like really critically endangered. How do you, at a certain point, critically endangered is just, it's the worst one?
Yeah, and this is kind of the problem with the IUCN categorizations, right? Are we saying that a species that has 800 animals left is as endangered as a species that has 13,000 left? I mean, that's the system that we have.
What's the cutoff for critically endangered?
I mean, it's not based on numbers. It's based on sort of what their future prospects are, right? You could have 500, but if that number looks like it's going to go up, then they wouldn't be critically endangered. It's sort of based on the prospects of extinction kind of thing. And
so, a lot of that's kind of algorithmic, right? Like how is their habitat lost?
Yeah.
What kind of, so like the pangolin, for example, is critically endangered, right? Because it's just, not in a good way.
It's being sort of, so the forest I was working in had 3 critically endangered species, and that was the Tapanuli orangutan, Sumatran tigers, and the Java pangolin. So giant Sunda pangolin.
Oh, so sad.
So those are our sort of critically endangered, and then a bunch of endangered.
And the pangolin, of course, because traditional Chinese medicine, they're using their the keratin. Is it keratin? Yeah, the scaly things on their outsides for dumb bullshit, quote unquote, medicine. The tigers, why? Is that also a human? I mean, it's always because of us, but is it... are they being killed for like food?
It's Chinese medicine.
Chinese medicine, because like their blood makes your penis bigger or something around them. Yeah.
It's funny how many of these things seem to be sort of sexually related, right?
Oh my God. I was talking the other day about donkey hide glue, donkey hide gelatin, which is like on the rise. On my other podcast, it's a Chinese medicine thing. And they're slaughtering donkeys the numbers are being decimated in China. So they've gone to Africa, and there are these plants where they're slaughtering, and it's really sad because some African nations have discovered that it's a problem. So they've outlawed it. It's still legal in not Zimbabwe, in not Tanzania. Anyway, it's still legal in this one country. And so we're finding that these poachers are basically stealing people's donkeys that are their livelihood. It's horrible. So people who are already impoverished are losing all of their income sources. But I was Googling online to see if I could find some, and you can just buy it on Amazon, right? And the like people who bought this also bought that like carousel at the bottom was all dildos. It was the weirdest thing. I was like, I guess it's a certain need that you have when you're shopping for this kind of weird Chinese medicine. All right, guys, I want to take a quick moment to thank the sponsors of this week's episode, starting with the Great Courses Plus. I've mentioned it before. I'm mentioning it again because I really, really believe in the Great Courses Plus, and I enjoy it too. It's a way that you can continue learning even without a traditional school, without a brick and mortar, and it's fun. Guys, with the Great Courses Plus, you have access, unlimited access, I should say, to over 8,500 fascinating lectures from some of the top professors, the top experts in the world. I mean, any topic you can think of, paleontology, astronomy, even how to play chess. And you can watch these lectures a bunch of different ways. You can stream them or you can download them so you can watch them when you're offline on your laptop, your TV, your device, your tablet or your phone, or you can listen podcast style with the Great Courses app. So this week I want to tell you about a great featured course called Your Deceptive Mind, a scientific guide to critical thinking skills. And guess who teaches it? My good friend, Dr. Stephen Novella from The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. He gives a really interesting look at the neuroscience behind how our brains work to process both information, but more importantly, misinformation. And I'm always getting questions about how can you tell the difference between science and pseudoscience. This is a great course to learn some of those skills. I know you're going to love the Great Courses Plus as much as I do, and I know that you want Talk Nerdy and the Great Courses Plus to have a long relationship, and the only way we're going to do that is if you go to their website right now and start your free trial with unlimited access to their entire library. You got to use my special URL, you guys. Okay, it's thegreatcoursesplus.com/nerdy. Once again, that's thegreatcoursesplus.com/nerdy. I also want to thank Blue Apron for their generous support of the show. Guys, if you haven't signed up for Blue Apron yet, now is the time to try. It's the leading meal kit delivery service in the US. And I know that you know a lot about Blue Apron because I've told you about it before, but you may not know that Blue Apron helps you make dinner in less than 45 minutes without a trip to the grocery store. And of course, the meals that you're going to be cooking are not the kinds of meals that you're used to cooking. They're delicious. They are creative. They're inventive. I mean, I make them at home, and also I sometimes will have them sent to my sister, and she'll call me and be like, Cara, I just cooked with ingredients I've never even heard of, and they were amazing. I want to tell you about some of the meals coming up this week. How about chicken and orange kale salad with spicy tahini dressing, or maybe sweet potato and mushroom bao buns with hoisin mayo and cabbage slaw, or the following week, oh my gosh, yum, baked ditali and creamy tomato sauce with broccoli and garlic breadcrumbs. Or how about spicy pork and Korean rice cakes with baby bok choy? My mouth is watering. I can't wait until my next delivery. Also, remember, guys, that this is high quality food. It's really flexible, so you're not locked into any ingredient. They have 12 new ones every week. And again, it's really convenient. It arrives straight to your door. There's a full color recipe card. All you got to do is open up the box and get to cooking. So guys, Blue Apron's treating you, the Talk Nerdy listeners, to $30 off your first order. That's huge. And you also get free shipping. You've just got to go to blueapron.com/nerdy. So check out this week's menu. Get your $30 off with free shipping at blueapron.com/nerdy. Okay, let's get back to the show. Okay, so pangolin and tiger, both for Chinese medicine. Mm-hmm. Is the orangutan for that same purpose, or is this not purely, but mostly habitat loss?
So orangutans all three species of orangutans are critically endangered because of two things. It's habitat loss and poaching, hunting, kind of humans killing them either for just fun, mm-hmm. or because they want to kill the mother and take the infant to sell the infant into the pet trade.
So it's not bushmeat?
No.
No, it's really. Because people think baby orangutans are cute.
Yeah, then, there's this sort of massive market for trading orangutans into the pet trade, and they.
But then who keeps how big are these things when they're full grown?
Well, I mean, this is an issue, right? But a baby orangutan stays a baby for a while, so people sort of think they can think they can have this cute pet.
How long do orangutans live?
Depends on how well you keep them in captivity, but certainly more than 40, 50 years kind of thing.
And they're giants.
Yeah.
They're enormous.
Yeah.
They're much bigger than people.
Similar size to people. I mean,
Really? Okay. I guess much bigger than me.
The big males will get up to sort of a couple of 100 pounds.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, it's a big, but they're also 4 times as strong as people. Like it's not a safe animal to have around kind of thing once they're older than about 6, 7, 8.
Yeah. I mean, obviously it goes without saying, like, don't keep an orangutan as a pet, but it's just bizarre to me that people, like, where do they, I mean, could you get away with that in the States? Nobody in the States is buying it.
Presumably there will be somewhere. I think the majority will go, no, I mean, they come into the States as well, but the majority will go, a lot go to sort of wealthy Indonesians. It's this interesting situation where potentially people who are responsible for protecting Indonesia's rainforest also happen to have a bunch of animals and things.
Yeah. I mean, you see that in certain countries in Africa. I had somebody on my show last year to talk about chimpanzees and this idea of bushmeat. And I always assume people ate bushmeat because they were like starving. And she's like, no, rich people eat bushmeat. It's a
delicacy.
Yeah, like, are you kidding me? Like only warlords, like super rich people.
The fanciest restaurants in sort of Paris will
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so it's definitely the same people who, are tasked with kind of doing the protection or it's terrible.
Yeah. Sort of military, chiefs of police, things like that. It's really interesting. And so it's kind of interesting that how we ended up with us on the species paper. So we had the genetics, which was sort of this interesting result, but it's not enough to kind of declare a new species on its own. And so what happened was the guys at Sumatran Orangutan Conservation Program, they got this phone call saying that there was an injured orangutan kind of in the village, and they went down and they collected it and brought it back to the quarantine station because they work on releasing the animals back into the wild. They kind of rehab them and release them again. And unfortunately, this male Raja, he sort of had been horribly treated, kind of had lots of different wounds, had been shot at with an air rifle and things like that, and was just not in a good condition. And they tried to save him.
So he was injured by hunters.
Yeah,
by poachers.
I mean, would we even say poachers? It's sort of people doing this for fun. It's not necessarily even a hunting thing.
It's horrible.
And so, unfortunately, he died from his wounds. But the guys at SOCP, Matthew Novak, and then a guy at the Australian National University, Anton Nurachayo, and Colin Groves, who unfortunately died recently, they measured the skull together. And sort of this became our second line of evidence. And so they found that this skull, again, was kind of between the Bornean and Sumatran species and had mosaic characteristics of both, but that the characteristics were very much different to both.
And it was this an adult orangutan?
Yeah, this is an adult male, a flanged male orangutan.
What does that mean?
Orangutans have this very interesting bimaturism, we call it. So they have 2 sexually mature male morphs.
Oh.
So you have adult males who stay small. They don't get the cheek pads. They don't get the throat sac. They sort of stay, let's say like 130 pounds, something like that, I'm guessing. But they sort of look about the same size as females. And they stay small. And then flanged males are the ones you sort of see.
The big flat faces.
The big flat faces and the cheek pads and the throat sacs.
And so how do you tell the difference can you tell the difference just ostensibly between an adult female and a non-flanged male?
Yeah,
you can
you can tell the difference. Partly because you can see the penis, but
one of them has a giant penis.
But also in terms of facial hair and things like
that.
They sort of look male.
So this was a flange male,
big male.
I'm assuming these are the only ones that ever become sort of alpha within, if that's even a thing.
Yeah, no. I mean, but again, it's sort of interesting that you have these 2 male morphs, which represent two mating strategies. So the small males are much faster. And will try and sneak copulations with females. They're sort of very coercive.
That's the biological word for raping. Yeah, that's what that is.
Sort of the polite term. So they'll follow the females around for kind of days. They'll
like
just keep following them around, wearing them down, and trying to sort of engage in copulations with them every so often and things. And depending on where you are, the females will seemingly, depending on whether, I don't want to sort of draw too much inferences, but it does seem to be depending on whether or not they're likely to conceive an infant, the females will sort of resist, or they'll kind of just lie there in the tree sort of thing. Whereas flanged males, the dominant males, will make these long calls, these long distance vocalizations. that attract females to them, and the females who are in estrus, who are cycling, will come and try and mate with them and will actively sort of participate in the mating process and clearly are trying to get sort of their offspring to have these genes.
And so it's less work for them, I would assume.
Yeah, but the strategies seem to be about the same level of success kind of thing.
So it's about 50-50 with the males.
Yeah, it depends on the site. And it's difficult to get enough genetic data to sort of say for definite.
I had no idea. I just assumed that all males look like that.
No.
Oh, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
Wow. Oh, that's so cool. Okay, so, and you're not on the genetic side of the evolutionary biology equation. You are on the behavioral side, right?
Yeah. So for this paper, I was working on those long distance vocalizations. So when I was out following the animals around, I would have a microphone and recorder with me. And in addition to taking the behavioral data, if they made these long distance vocalizations, I'd record them. And then once I sort of got back to camp, you can plug them into a computer program and try and sort of tease them out. And
so did the different species make different vocalizations?
So it's the same vocalization. Mm-hmm. It's a long call. It's a long distance vocalization. And it sounds similar to your sort of naked hearing. Mm-hmm. But yeah, we found differences between, so I've worked across Sumatra and Borneo, and then I was sort of fortunate enough that other researchers gave me their calls as well from different sites. We can't really do a paper like this without collaboration from a bunch of different places. And so similarly to the guys who did the genetic comparisons, and similarly to Matt, Anton, and Colin who did the skull comparisons, I sort of got 150 calls from 50 animals around the place. 3 of them were from Batang Toro, and I would compare these vocalizations statistically, and we found, again, the Batang Toro individuals are sort of different to the other 2 populations.
And so they were different sort of in a way that you could really only use this software to tease out.
So there's certain differences that are very obvious. So, So on Sumatra, the calls are much, much longer.
Gotcha.
You're sort of looking at, I'm not sort of sure what I'd say the average is. This is actually what I'm working on at the moment, the chapter that I'm writing out at the moment. But we're talking minutes difference, right?
Oh, wow.
My Bornean calls tend to roll in at about a minute, and Sumatran ones are sort of 4, 5, 6, 7.
Oh, my God.
So,
must be so obnoxious.
So, yeah. There's ways around it. You just analyze the first 30 seconds in detail, and then the rest of it you do in slightly less detail, because otherwise you could be there forever. So the Batang Toro calls were much longer, much more similar to the other Sumatran animals to the north on that front. In Borneo, though, they're much, much higher pitched, and you can hear that. It's really, really sort of obvious. And so interestingly, the Batang Toro calls were also high pitched, like the Bornean ones. So you kind of have this mosaic of characteristics between the 2.
So just multiple lines of evidence now, behavioral lines, genetic lines, and physiological lines, or I guess morphological lines. You're right. That would be morphological. All pointing to the fact that this kind of southern species, or the southern group at this point, you still didn't know,
is a separate lineage.
Is separate.
Yeah.
Because it's just different enough from both, really.
Yeah. And so then we start thinking in terms of, do we also have a compelling narrative for this, right? We know they're geographically separate. What are the mechanisms for their separation? What is the habitat looking like? I mean, obviously these guys are up in the mountain. It is completely different to where I worked in Sumatra. Where I worked further north in Sumatra. It's kind of cold. There's a lot more rainfall. The fruits that they're eating are completely different. They're kind of, in this very different ecological niche. And so these are the kind of situations that we need to see for speciation to occur, right?
Yeah, so there's all these different environmental pressures on these guys. And of course, it I think, brings up the question that is maybe the question, which is like, how different does something need to be before it's another species?
Right.
Because technically, it no longer really holds that species can't interbreed, right? Because you can breed a dog and a wolf, I guess, but those are subspecies. Those are both Canis.
No, I think they
what do
are
you call it?
Species.
They are? Okay. Yeah, Canis lupus. I think it's Canis lupus and Canis lupus domesticus.
Oh, really?
I could be wrong. They might actually be the same species. I'm looking that up.
Interesting.
But maybe I'm wrong. I'm wrong.
Yeah, so I would say I think we have a very strong case here. And I think it's sort of based on things like how geographically separate they are, these multiple lines of evidence. But, there have been people coming out and saying that they wouldn't sort of classify this as a different species. It's kind of this classic lumpers versus splitters.
Yeah, is it a quote-unquote subspecies or is it a species?
Yeah, right, within evolutionary biology. And there are people who believe sort of going in one direction and people who believe in going another.
And a good example of that, I just looked it up and it literally says, and I said domesticus, which is, I just made that up, it's familiaris, but the domestic dog, parenthesis, Canis lupus familiaris or Canis familiaris. So it's probably even an argument within dog evolutionists.
And so I think there's an interesting conversation to be had there.
Yeah.
But it's also very, very academic, right?
Okay.
We're in a situation here where there's, let's say 40,000 roughly on Borneo, 13,000 in northern Sumatra and 800 in southern Sumatra. If you lump them all together from a conservation standpoint, it's not really great because these small populations, people will be like, well, it doesn't matter. We've only lost 800. There's still 50,000 left, in other locations and things like that. And so having this species designation obviously is also really important from a conservation standpoint.
Because the truth is, you lose all 800 of them. Sure, you've got more orangutans left, but you have no more of that orangutan.
Yeah.
And the truth is, there's probably some difference in every single tiny ecological niche in the world. You lose a population of something that lives in a pond, and there's going to be a little bit of genetic difference in that insect in the pond than the insect in the pond next door. And at what point is the difference a big enough difference that it's meaningful? And that, of course, opens up this conversation about conservation as a whole, which is saving animals for the sake of saving them. Right. Or is it about, returning things to how they used to be? Is it about finding balance as things are right now?
And the question also is, what do you save? Which species do you prioritize? Is it sort of, are you trying to get the rarest species? Are you trying to get the ones that have the best prognosis for survival kind of thing? Like, how do you...
all jellyfish. That's all we need on this planet.
How do you decide where you're going to put your resources and things? And it is kind of a major issue. Right?
And is there something wrong with this emotional kind of attraction or familiarity that we have with like megafauna? Like, wanting to say... And from an ecological kind of perspective, really big organisms have a big niche, don't they? Like they downstream, they affect a lot of smaller organisms.
Yeah. We think of them sort of as these classic umbrella species, right? If you protect elephants, if you protect the habitat of elephants, they cover a massive range. And so you can protect everything that's within that habitat. And they're sort of these charismatic megafauna that people want to protect. I think there can be a bit of a problem in terms of the resources are only going to sort of these pretty animals that are living in certain forests and less kind of charismatic animals get sort of left by the wayside.
Like the pangolin.
Yeah. And so you sort of have these differing priorities. For me personally, I like the idea of protecting landscapes, right? Rather than going for individual animals, you sort of go for these big chunks of forest that are left. Things like the Losa ecosystem in Sumatra, it's 2.6 million hectares, like it's massive.
And you determine what is the balance right now and how do we maintain it? Yeah. Okay.
So it's a hard one.
Yeah.
It's a hard one. And so that kind of is the next challenge now that the species has sort of been declared. It's obviously it's already been declared critically endangered by the IUCN, but it's got a lot of very immediate threats towards it. So
like what?
So at the moment, there's plans to put in a hydroelectric development, which will destroy sort of about 10% of the area. And it's weird. Everybody thinks of hydro as being this very sustainable sort of green power. But obviously building a massive dam in the middle of this habitat, you have to build roads to get in there. You have to sort of put a lot of infrastructure in. You have to cut down a bunch of forest. And so that will destroy about 10% of the habitat, but also will separate and fragment this population of 800 animals smaller and smaller and smaller. And so you're basically guaranteeing their extinction.
So why do they need to do hydroelectric, or why do they want to do hydroelectric right there?
Yeah, I don't know the exact reasons why they'd want to do it right there. Certainly Indonesia needs more energy. There certainly is a desire for greater development on that front. I lived in Medan a lot of the time, and we'd have kind of rolling brownouts and things like that. So there certainly is a need much as something like 50 million people, there is a need for power. Yeah, putting it in that specific area, that's one of the things that hopefully will, in part because of this species designation, will be reconsidered.
Yeah, maybe they'll be able to find a better place for it.
Yeah, sort of, presumably it's cheaper or something like, right? It's easier to put it in this area than it is
no
to
one
put
lives
it in another
there.
area.
It's always going to be more expensive to put it in a place where there's already development.
Yeah, and you can do things like get the timber out and stuff like that. You can sort of have knock-on effects and stuff. So that's sort of a critical kind of campaign point that there is now that kind of needs to be worked on, is kind of not necessarily saying that people can't have a hydroelectric dam, but don't put it here.
Yeah.
Don't put it in the area that you have. You're gonna guarantee the extinction of this species that we've just discovered. There's also a bunch of tigers in there. You've got pangolins, you've got tapirs. You sort of have this huge amount of biodiversity that's all going to be lost if the development goes in there. So.
And also maybe don't shoot them with an air rifle. Like, how is that?
That's
how do you fight against that?
Long term, the need for the area certainly is to have a strong kind of management unit, a strong kind of preventative measures. It's sort of very hard as a Western researcher, right? I don't want to be going in there and telling people how to sort of manage their protected areas and things like that, right? That's a question for the Indonesian government, and like you'd much rather have Indonesians running these projects than have Westerners coming in.
Absolutely.
So I think the plan the government are putting together is to develop a KPH, which is sort of a management unit that will sort of work and do patrols and build boundary markers and things like that. It's sort of this funny thing that I never really realized, is that boundary markers are incredibly expensive, and just you think sort of sticking some fencing around an area is kind of going to be cheap, and no, because people have to hike through the jungle for hours and go camp out there and build and carry the cement and things like that. Like it's a real process that takes a lot of time, and you have to discuss with the local community, what are you doing? Why are these boundaries here? What does it all mean? And it's a whole process. But certainly, the development of that unit is sort of critical for the long-term viability of the area, and kind of preventing this gradual creep into the forest and encroachment, sort of hunting and things like that.
So moving forward in your career, once you defend and you are free, but then trapped by whatever faculty position or nonprofit position or wherever you move on and start working, you're interested in doing conservation biology.
Yeah, much more the applied conservation side.
So, of course, these big questions that get really political are going to be things that you have to grapple with, aren't they? Do you think that it's a function? I mean, of course, the answer is all of the above, but is it a function of needing more education? Is it a function of needing more sort of police or military kind of intervention? How do we handle some of the most basic problems with conservation, which are literally like people behaving badly?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Not anything more complicated than people needing energy, people needing shelter, basic needs needing to be fulfilled that are in direct conflict with conservation efforts, but literally people shooting at great apes with air rifles for fun. Like, how do you approach something like that? And why do people do this?
Yeah, so obviously education is something that would be really, really useful. I think obviously rule of law is kind of a big catch-all phrase for kind of dealing with these problems, and certainly it is something that does need to be dealt with. But Indonesia has very, very strong environmental laws, but they don't get enforced. So having proper enforcement is obviously a big thing that will help. This is Indonesia specific, right? But I think rule of law in general could be expanded across all kind of conservation issues. And I think for me, certainly, again, I kind of touch back on this idea of, white people, Western, Northern kind of NGOs, as we would say, coming in and telling people what to do. I think there is a need to kind of to build capacity within local communities and build these kind of structures and governance mechanisms in place that allow local people to take ownership over their own resources and over their own natural resources, and to see the value.
Yeah.
Because, you have an organization come in and put a bunch of work into protecting the area or whatever, like a big international NGO, but they're there for 3 years on a $3 million project or whatever. And what do you see at the end of it, kind of thing? Like, and so that certainly for me, I've been very fortunate to work with local organizations that have really prioritized this community involvement. And so I worked in Sumatra with Sumatran Orangutan Conservation Program and in Borneo with Borneo Nature Foundation. Both of them have been working in Indonesia for sort of 20 years, have sort of tens of Indonesian staff who manage a lot of the day-to-day work and do sort of implement these programs and things like that. And they have good relationships with local government, and they have good relationships with national government, and they have this infrastructure, and they've worked really hard to develop those relationships and develop those expertise and use kind of scientific methodology and method and data collection to provide evidence for what they're trying to get done. And obviously that to me is how we have to go about doing these things.
It's so important too, because there's so many ethical issues surrounding this sort of like paternalistic, sort of imperialistic, colonial approach to conservation that go much farther than, getting in there, getting something accomplished, leaving, and it all going to shit. It like breeds kind of a culture of like dependency, and it also just has this like really bad, deep yuck factor.
Icky, right?
It's really icky.
It's neocolonialism and it's
absolutely
finest.
And it's kind of like, oh, you can't take care of your own shit. Let us come in and take care of it for you. And of course, that's never going to work, or at least it's never going to work long term.
Yeah.
But there are so many opportunities out there. I think one thing about conservation that always excites me when I get to talk about it on the show, and I talk about this with my friend Jason Goldman a lot, and he wrote up a Nat Geo article about this work that you did. It's hard sometimes. He's a freelance journalist writing about conservation and urban wildlife. It's hard to not constantly write really fucking depressing stories.
Yeah.
But there's so much hope on the other side of that, almost more than in any other field. There's so much hope.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that first you have to identify these places and these organisms that are in peril. And once you can identify them, you can work to do something about it. And so I think it's really cool that this project specifically that you were involved with helped identify these organisms that really do, I think, need help to make sure that their numbers maintain and potentially even grow. And so it's cool that you did that. It's cool that you're continuing to work on that. Is that all your thesis is about? What other stuff are you talking about in your thesis? I got to ask before I let you go.
Yeah.
You have a meeting. You have to get to your meeting. I'm keeping you too long.
Yeah. Well, so I'm looking at generally the behavior of these 4 different populations of orangutans. So this new species...
Wait, I thought there were only 3. I'm confused.
So 4 different populations across 3 species.
And
then 2 subspecies of Bornean. It gets very complicated when we start getting into...
lumping and splitting
and things like that. But yeah, I'm basically looking at kind of... their vocal behavior, how are they using these vocalizations as part of their mating strategies? But then also just generally, what are they doing in these different habitats? So I've sort of been very lucky in that I was working at a brand new field site in the north of Sumatra, kind of in the eastern lowlands where no one's ever done research before. And it's a really sort of neat site where we see some very kind of Bornean-like behaviors, kind of see that the habitat ecology seems to drive orangutans to have a certain strategy in lower productivity habitats. Then obviously working at Batang Toro at high altitude was great. And then I was at Sabangau in central Borneo, which was peat swamp and,
horrible.
I mean, it was lovely in terms of the
data.
The camp was much nicer. Sort of hanging out with a bunch of friends and things like that. But the actual day-to-day of following the orangutans is way harder. Like my advisor came out from USC and sort of said that he's a chimp guy, Craig Stanford. And he was saying that, he'd never done anything as hard as working in a peat swamp. Like, this is just, why would you do research there?
And he's probably been to the Congo.
Yeah. Like he was at Gombe kind of following chimps around for 13 hours a day or whatever. And kind of, it's,
wow.
I think peat swamps are pretty brutal. And then I was up in Kutai in the Eastern Borneo for a summer, and that was an absolute disaster in sort of every way imaginable. I kind of turn up and there's no infrastructure, there's no kind of nothing. I didn't really speak Indonesian at that point, and I'm kind of just trying to wing it together kind of thing. No, it was definitely, I mean, for me, I've always really loved the field aspect, right? I get to go and run around the jungle and see these amazing animals all day, every day, and it's really, really inspiring. And I'm I'm studying the lucky ones, right? These are the wild animals. These are the ones that haven't had their mothers killed and sort of been sold into the pet trade. These are kind of
they're not in a reserve
or in an enclosure. This is literally just the middle of the jungle in a national park or in a wildlife preserve. And so that side of things, it's sort of, as you say, it is very easy to get very kind of doom and gloom on the conservation front, but there are these projects and these people who are working towards sort of these amazing things. And we sort of all have to keep, because conservationists could be the sort of suckiest people to be around. Like, I'm sure I'm pretty bad for it when I start talking about kind of all the negatives around, what's everything that's happening with deforestation and with kind of hunting and things like that. But honestly, as you say, there are these real positives out there.
Yeah. So I have to ask, I close every episode with the same 2 questions, and I'd love to ask you the same 2 questions. I don't want to typecast you and assume what you're going to say. So they're super big picture questions, so I apologize for that in advance. But the first one is, when you're thinking about the future, in kind of whatever context is meaningful for you right now, obviously you're working on your dissertation, but also you have these really big picture global issues that you're facing all the time. So whatever's relevant to you, number 1, what is the thing, if you had to pick one thing, that sort of keeps you up the most at night? The thing that you're so concerned about, really worried about, it preoccupies you. It's like negative, right? Mm-hmm. But on the flip side of that, so we don't all like cry ourselves to sleep tonight, what are you most hopeful and excited and optimistic about? What are you looking forward to?
Sure. Can't be this off the top of my head.
Chew on it for a second. I know.
No, I mean, obviously for me, working in tropical rainforests, I mean, deforestation is the obvious thing that concerns me and that keeps me up, and that is the hunting and the pet trade and things like that is all so interrelated to things that drive deforestation, right? You build a road in, then people go and cut down the forest, then they go and kill animals and bring them out and things, and you just get people getting closer and closer and the forest getting smaller and smaller.
So you've got just to interject, you've got the hunting, you've got pet trade, you've got like cutting down wood to get in to build roads, but also cutting down wood to sell tropical hardwoods, timber. You've got there are places in the Amazon where they're mining for gold, and they're what are some other reasons?
Agriculture. You sort of see in South America these large areas that are cut down for cattle ranching. Mm-hmm. That's a major problem. Pulp and paper. In Asia, obviously, our big one is palm oil.
Okay. Palm oil.
Palm oil is obviously the big one.
Is it help to look for the thing on the package?
For sure.
That's
definitely.
What you should do. Is
definitely look for the sustainable palm oil marking.
Because then it's farmed?
So there's different, I don't know exactly what the rules are, but the principle of the thing is that you're not cutting down tropical rainforest to grow your oil palm, you're reusing previously logged areas or reusing oil palm plantations.
Whatever it is, it's sustainable.
Just doing it in a more sustainable way, and you're paying your workers sort of fair trade wages and kind of not exacerbating the problem by kind of exploiting people so they then have to go and seek alternative employment, which is sort of non-sustainable and things like that, or go hunting animals and stuff like that.
Gotcha. Or maybe use another kind of oil.
Yeah. It's people obviously love to boycott palm oil. That's kind of
Is that not the answer?
It's not really the answer.
So go for sustainable versions of it.
Sustainable is always going to be better for everything, right? I mean, and there's questions in terms of how sustainable something is, right? But having the consumers actually have a lot of power here, right? They can, if they start consuming things that are, or start using products that are sustainably forested or are sustainably grown, that's going to drive businesses in the third world, in the developing world, to use more sustainable methods. And it sort of has this positive feedback, right? You're doing something positive that's causing someone else to take a positive action rather than doing something negative to try and stop someone doing something.
And you're growing an industry which tells other people that there's an economic reason to do it the right way.
Yeah. And obviously the hope is at the same time that someone will come up with kind of synthetic palm oil or something like that. And I know that there are efforts, to grow.
I know nothing about this. I don't cook.
No, palm oil's in everything. It's really bad. It's sort of everything in the...
That's true. I buy. I don't cook, but I buy, which means I need to be more careful.
I mean, palm oil's sort of an absolute nightmare on that front. It's in all your processed foods. It's in your cosmetics. It's in cleaning products.
See, you bring this up in the last 2 minutes.
I know.
We're going to be
Sorry.
talking about this whole hour. Okay. Let's get to something positive.
Sure.
Let's get to something positive.
I mean, there's a lot of kind of amazing organizations out there doing really, really neat work. I mentioned earlier the ones that I already work with. That's obviously really great. I really like E.O. Wilson's Half Earth movement. So this is this idea that in order to protect the biodiversity on this planet, we need to protect half of it. And so finding different mechanisms and different methods to do that. So whether that be increasing private lands conservation or increasing the number and amount of national parks. Obviously, that's a bit of an issue in this country at the moment.
But so wait, half of the planet. Yeah. If we protect half the planet,
it's half of the terrestrial.
Okay.
And it may be 30% of the ocean, I think, is the right amount.
I feel like we're protecting like 1% of the ocean right now.
I mean, but I feel like also because the ocean's much deeper, there's sort of...
but the ocean's shit right now. Right. It's shit. So do you know what percentage of the terrestrial land we actively protect? I mean, it's garbage. Sure. It's probably like 0.5%.
It's not going to be that much.
I'm sure it's not. Okay, so we got to up our game.
Because the Sustainable Development Goals was something like 17% was the aim for maybe this year, something like that. And I think it's pretty close. I think it's not like too far away from that. I'd have to check.
So we just need to triple that.
But yeah, I mean, that's still a very long way from 50%, right?
Interesting. Okay. So, but it's good, I think, to have a tangible, like actual goal. That's how people work towards that psychologically. It makes the most sense.
See, there's a lot of energy behind it. It's a really interesting project, right? It's a really interesting idea to try and I think having these goals that are so much of conservation these days is very, very pragmatic and very, very like, how do we marketize conservation and get people and get businesses involved and stuff like that? And there is definitely a place for that. But I think having these big picture, big goals, I think you've always got to try and shoot for the stars kind of thing and try and hope and sort of be optimistic about things, right? And I guess that was what your question was, is what's the most optimistic
full circle
thoughts.
And we have to be, as citizens and voters, we have to push our representatives to do that. Because they won't do it unless they think the people who will vote for them want it, Like, we actually do have a lot of power. Doesn't seem like it always, but the truth of the matter is, if your representatives feel like their constituency is turning on them, they will bow to your will because they desperately need you to stay in office. That's all they give a shit about. So we've got to make sure our voices are heard there too, that we're very loud and proud and clear about that. Well, gosh, James, this was so much fun. It was so enlightening. I learned like 10 new things about orangutans I never knew. I'm sure everybody listening did too. So I just have to say thank you so much for joining me. It was a lot of fun. Are you active on social media at all? Mediat? That's not a word. Is there a place where people can see the work that you're doing or say hello?
Yeah. I'm on Twitter. I think it's James A. Askew.
He thinks it's James A. Askew. Yeah, we'll see. How often do you tweet, James?
Not that often. It's all retweets.
Okay, so we're all going to like bug him and then he'll get more active on there. Well, thank you so much for joining me. It was an absolute blast. And thank you everyone for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.